In this third and last introductory video, sort of covering the sweep of American history, we're going to look more at the 20th century. And again, all of these three videos are simply to provide context so you can better understand the discussion of aspects of culture that will follow later in the course. But in the late 19th century, as we've mentioned, there were aggrieved people in the Industrial Revolution. The poor immigrant factory workers and the farmers, they were hurt by the peak of the Industrial Revolution. And so they're going to sort of get together and form what became known as the Populist Movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The Populist Movement, however, was, while demanding government action and an end to the government's laissez-faire policies, it was short-lived and didn't succeed. Of course, as well, the problems of the Industrial Revolution remained. And in the early 20th century, a new, broader reform movement grew, the Progressive Movement. And that included not only the workers and the farmers who'd been in the Populist Movement just before, but also the middle class. The Progressive Movement's going to continue into World War I. And it saw many reforms adopted at the state and federal level that transformed what people expected of their governments. The Progressive Age of the early 20th century is just a really important period in American history. There are many accomplishments, too many to even note. There are things like new safety standards, better wages and hours required for workers, reforms to fight political corruption. There was the first income tax. There were new efforts to protect the natural environment and conservation. There were efforts to get women's rights. There was the establishment of the Federal Reserve. There were education reforms. And there was prohibition, among many other reforms. And they all dramatically impacted the lives of most Americans. Only African Americans suffering from the racist Jim Crow laws didn't in some way benefit. As the progressive era of the early 20th century transformed America, the country embraced imperialism, a product of such factors as the closing of the frontier in the West and better transportation and communication in the industrial age. Competing with other industrial powers, the United States gained new territories and won the Spanish-American War in 1898. Not surprisingly, competitive industrialization and the competing for colonies in the age of imperialism led to World War I. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1917, but the United States joined the war late, fighting from 1917 to 1918. Beginning in World War I, there was the Great Migration, so-called, of African Americans from the rural South, where they'd been sharecroppers in Reconstruction, to the industrial northern and western cities, where there was work in the wartime factories. This migration of African Americans from the rural South to all throughout the United States obviously profoundly impacted all Americans. The sense that World War I had accomplished little to make the world safe contributed to a growing pessimism about government's ability to make things better. In addition, a sense from the war that people ought to enjoy life while they could sort of all came together to help end the progressive age and contribute to making the decade of the 1920s the famous Jazz Age, or it was called the Roaring Twenties. The spread of new appliances and cheaper industrialized products to middle America made the economy boom, and the way many Americans lived their lives changed dramatically. Some embraced this cultural dynamism while others did not. All of this added to the sense of making the 1920s, it was a really exciting period in American history. I had mentioned that there was the great migration of blacks to northern cities. Well, in New York City, blacks had been kicked out into their own communities, and that ironically allowed their culture to flourish. They were kicked to the area of Harlem, and we'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance, this period of and a rather ironic flourishing of black culture in the midst of all this Jim Crow. Of course, at the end of the 1920s, the stock market crash of 1929 sent the country into the worst economic downturn in its history. The Great Depression lasted all the way from the stock market crash in 1929 throughout the 1930s and obviously impacted the way people lived. The economic agony of the Great Depression led to a rebirth of faith in government, a demand that the federal government should intervene and help. Now, this sense, of course, underscored the New Deal activism of the 1930s. The New Deal was a program of government intervention led by President Franklin Roosevelt that once again augmented the role of government in daily lives. The New Deal, for example, created the Social Security system we have today. What got us out of the Great Depression was, of course, World War II. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945, but the United States only joined in late 1941. World War II ended the Great Depression, as I say, and left the United States a dominant world power, certainly the world's largest and most important economy. The war once again transformed the way everyday Americans lived, most notably for women and African Americans. In the years after World War II, the nation embarked on a decades-long economic boom, unparalleled prosperity that characterized the 1950s and contributed to the growth of the American car culture and the suburbanization of America. Here on the bottom right, you can see 100% doubling of the gross national product in the post-war years. Of course, in all this prosperity, there was the famous baby boom. The number of Americans born in the period from 1946 to 1964 was astounding. A baby was born every 7 seconds in 1957. And this large demographic, of course, has impacted American history ever since. The post-war prosperity contributed to the African American civil rights movement, and by the 1960s, the final end to Jim Crow and the first true legal and political equality for African Americans. The economic boom contributed to a new wave of liberalism, an expanded effort to wage a, quote, war on poverty that remained. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society once again expanded the role of the federal government in Americans' daily lives, creating, for example, Medicare and Medicaid, new job training, and immigration reform, among many other efforts. The Great Society's immigration reforms contributed to a new wave of immigration, including increased immigration from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. The growing Hispanic and Asian population in the following years was most impactful. By the late 1960s, the baby boomers had grown, and with the economic prosperity, the late 1960s created a counterculture that left indelible marks on American culture and history. Women's rights and feminism, environmentalism, and sexual liberation were only a few of the sweeping cultural changes. The 1960s, like the 1920s earlier, was a seminal decade in American history. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The post-World War II years may have seen economic prosperity and dramatic cultural change, but in foreign policy there was still the infamous Cold War. World War II had left the U.S. and the communist Soviet Union dominant in a bipolar world, competing against each other. The Cold War lasted from after World War II all the way into 1991, when the Soviet Union fell. Over this period, the Cold War involved a number of frightening skirmishes, all of which increased anti-communism in American politics and society. Among the major conflicts that took place over the Cold War years was the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. The Vietnam War took place in the decades following World War II, but the United States dramatically increased its efforts against the communists in this war in the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, by 1975, the effort had failed. By the 1970s, the post-war economic boom had begun to end, most notably with the infamous energy crisis of the mid-1970s and the stagflation that followed, stagflation being the odd combination of high inflation and high unemployment, just a really bad economic period. By the 1980s, the emerging technological revolution would turn around the economy and lead to a new economic boom. The growth of computers in the 1980s and the internet in the 1990s contributed to new growth and, once again, revolutionized the way Americans lived. All of this contributed to increasing globalization, which impacted the United States in both positive and negative ways. The end of the Cold War in 1991 did not necessarily make the world a safer place. In the early 1990s, the United States led a multinational force against Iraq's invasion of neighboring Kuwait, the Iraq War of 1990 and 1991. The horrible World Trade Center attack on September 11th, 2001 led, of course, to the War on Terror, as we call it, which included years-long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, the United States remains as dynamic as it ever has, always changing but remaining a world leader, not only in the realm of the economy and foreign policy, but also in culture. In this third video, we've looked at the 20th century, but all three of them together are hopefully going to give you some of the context that students will need to understand the discussions of particular aspects of culture that will follow later in the class. In any event, this concludes the third and last introductory video.